Hello everybody, Math 11 Quarter 1 Week 2 lesson plans. Let's go right into Week 2 of Math 11, otherwise known as Algebra 2. You got to get a diagnostic test before you can join this course, students. And Week 2 lesson plans, name date here, students, on your lesson plan notice. Let's go right into Week 2 here. And we start out with 1.4, solved by factoring, classwork homework part 1, classwork homework part 2, classwork homework part 3. So we got 3 parts lessons here for solved by factoring. Then we go 1.5, solve quadratics by square roots, classwork homework part 1, classwork homework part 2. And then classwork homework part 3, so we got a 3-part classwork there for solving quads by square roots. And then we go into 1.6, perform operations with complex numbers. Classwork homework part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. That's a 4-part lesson for performing operations with complex numbers. And what do we got? And we got a quiz. We got one quiz here, week 2. 1.4 quiz, solved by factoring. Do we have another quiz? No. So our standards for this week is A.SSE.3a. That's our big standard for week 2 is A.SSE.3a. And so our intro, well, here it is again. So there you go. Factor a quadratic expression to reveal the zeros of the function it defines. And then, so add, subtract, multiply complex numbers. This would be our intro and our learning targets here. Use the identity I squared equals -1 to simplify expressions. Apply the commutative, associative, and distributive properties to complex number operations. And then up here, our other standard here is Common Core REI, and it's blocked out by this thing here. Can't believe it. And then modifications and accommodations for week 2 available online via Google Classroom interface. That is grades, classwork, homework, quizzes, tests, Zoom, tutoring on request. And we start out here with week 2 of 1.4, part 1, classwork, 30 points, 2 points in note taking. 1.4 is solve ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 by factoring. And then we got part 1 homework, 67 points there. And then we go 1.4 part 2 classwork, 22 points. 8 points here of note taking for part 2 classwork. And then we go 1.4 part 2 homework, 70 points, 8 points of classwork. Then we go part 3 here, 1.4 classwork, 26 points, 20 points of note taking for part 3 classwork. And then we go into homework here, 64 points. And then 20 points of note taking for the homework for part 3 of 1.4, solve ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 by factoring. And the predominant standard is A.SSE.3a, which is factor a quadratic expression to reveal the zeros of the function it defines. Let me go further in here to week 2, Math 11, quarter 1, 1.4 quiz. So we come up with a quiz here, 70 points for the quiz for week 2. And then we go off now. Oh, this finishes off A.SSE.3a. Factor a quadratic expression to reveal the zeros of the function it defines. Off further into week 2, we go into 1.5. 36 points classwork part 1 here, 5 points note taking. And then 1.5 homework, 36 points of homework for part 1. 1.5 part 2 classwork, 30 points, 6 points of note taking. And then our standard here is A.REI.4b, solve quadratic equations by inspection. For example, for x squared equals 49, taking square roots, completing the square, the quadratic formula, and factoring it as appropriate to the initial form of the equation. Recognize when the quadratic formula gives complex solutions, and write them as a plus bi for the real numbers a and b. And then we go 1.5 here, part 2. Homework is 69 points of homework. 1.5 part 3 classwork, 22 points. For the classwork, 1.5 part 3, 1.5 part 3 homework is 74 points. For 1.5, solve quadratic equations by finding square roots. And then we go into, further into week 2, our predominant standard now is n.c(n.2). Use the relation I squared equals -1 and the commutative, associative, and distributive properties to add, subtract, and multiply complex numbers. We go into 1.6, and we go into 1.6 homework here, 48 points, 17 points in note taking. Is perform operations with complex numbers. 1.6 part 2 classwork is 24 points of classwork, 4 points of note taking. For 1.6, perform operations with complex numbers. And then our part 2 homework is 61 points of homework. And this predominant standard here is n.c(n.2). Use the relation I squared equals -1 and the commutative, associative, and distributive properties to add, subtract, and multiply complex numbers. Then we go 1.6 part 3 classwork, 22 points. 11 points of note taking for part 3 classwork. 1.6 part 3 homework is 56 points. And then 1.6 part 4 classwork, 24 points. 10 points in note taking for 1.6 part 4. Perform operations with complex numbers. And then maybe finally here, finishing week 2, we got our homework here. Part 4 homework is 84 points. And with 1.6, perform operations with complex numbers. And again, our predominant standard here is n.c(n.2). Use relation I squared equals -1 and the commutative, associative, and distributive properties to add subtract, and multiply complex numbers. And animated PowerPoint math video at AO.com. For questions, course materials, thank you very much.